Hey there, welcome to this explainer. Have you ever actually wondered what happens to, say, a massive multi-ton MRI machine when a hospital is just done with it? Well, I am super thrilled you're here today because we are taking a highly focused deep dive into the SASB standards for medical equipment and supplies, specifically looking at sustainability. We're going to unpack exactly how companies are expected to report on the life cycle of their medical products. We'll track it all the way from managing the environmental and human health impacts of chemical inputs during the design phase, right through to quantifying the physical waste when a device reaches the end of its life. If you want to understand how the medical industry measures true environmental impact, you are in exactly the right place. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to hit the medical product life cycle, look at managing chemicals and health, and then proving true environmental benefits. After that, we'll dive into quantifying product takebacks and wrap it up by comparing devices versus simple supplies. Okay, let's just dive right into this. If we look at the SASB standard, our playground for today is the product design and lifecycle management category. There's a whole sea of compliance metrics out there covering everything from product safety to business ethics, but we're focusing purely on those two codes right over on the right. That's HCMS 410A.1, which handles the qualitative design strategy, and HCMS 410A.2, which measures the quantitative physical waste. All right, Section 1, the medical product life cycle, from drawing board to disposal. So I want you to imagine a complex medical device. It could be that MRI machine we just mentioned, or maybe a really specialized surgical tool. This standard basically asks us to treat this product like it has a life of its own. A company can't just manufacture it, sell it, and then wash their hands of the whole thing. No way. They've got to account for the impacts before it even exists, and they have to take responsibility for it after it's no longer useful. Think about that before phase for a second. Metric 410A1 requires a comprehensive discussion and analysis. Now, in SASB terms, that means we aren't looking at a single hard number just yet. We're looking for a detailed, qualitative narrative. The standard demands that medical companies explicitly discuss their strategic process for how they assess and manage the environmental and human health impacts of the chemical inputs in their products. They need a plan, and they absolutely have to make it public. Moving on to Section 2, managing chemicals and health. The 5 key considerations. Now, when they're building out that strategic plan, the SASB standard doesn't let companies just wave their hands vaguely and say, hey, we're going green. Not quite. A company's strategic approach actually has to address 5 specific impacts. They've got to look at the energy efficiency of the product while it's in use. They have to consider how it's ultimately going to be disposed of. They need to analyze material efficiency, as well as the bulk of the product packaging. And perhaps most importantly for human health, which is a major focus here, they must assess the toxicity of the chemical inputs used to actually build it. Every single one of these factors has to be weighed right at the very beginning, during the design phase. And it doesn't stop there. The standard also asks companies to disclose the actual real-world mechanisms they use to implement all these environmental considerations. So they might use strict design protocols, or maybe enforce new procurement policies with their vendors. A really powerful tool you'll see here is the Restricted Substances List, or RSL. This is basically a hard line in the sand, a literal list of toxic chemicals that simply are not allowed in their products. They might also rely on third-party certifications. The main takeaway for us here is that concrete action is required. Good intentions alone just aren't going to cut it. Which brings us to Section 3, proving true environmental benefits, avoiding vague claims. Corporate sustainability reports can sometimes be filled with, well, a lot of marketing fluff. But the SASB standard actually has a built-in defense mechanism against greenwashing. It strictly dictates that companies can only claim design considerations if they deliver a specific, demonstrable environmental benefit. You literally can't just slap a little green leaf on the box and call it a day. It has to relate directly to measurable improvements in energy consumption, environmental health, human health, waste generation, or water use. And the reporting entity has to make this determination in good faith, clarifying whether the benefit applies to the product itself, the packaging, or the service. Broad general statements, totally off limits. And here's the ultimate accountability check for this whole qualitative metric. After all that talk about strategy, chemicals, and design protocols, the company actually has to disclose the percentage of their products, measured by revenue, that have these environmental considerations integrated into their design. It literally forces companies to put their money where their mouth is. If you talk a big game about sustainable design, but it turns out it only applies to like 2% of your revenue, believe me, investors are absolutely going to notice that. All right, Section 4, quantifying product takebacks, the end-of-life sequence. So, We are now officially pivoting to the after phase of the product lifecycle. We're leaving the qualitative narrative behind and we are moving straight into cold, hard data. We aren't talking about design revenue anymore. We are talking about physical end-of-life waste, metric tons. That is the exact unit of measure here. The standard demands to know the total physical weight of the products a company is accepting for take-back at the end of their useful life. Just to give you an idea of that scale, a single MRI machine can weigh over 4 metric tons all by itself. This is a massive shift in perspective because it forces the company to build these complex reverse logistics supply chains just to physically recover the equipment they originally put out into the world. But here's the catch. You don't get credit just for throwing the product in the back of a truck. The standard has really strict rules on what actually counts. To be included in those metric tons, the recovered product must be actively reused, like, say, being refurbished for another hospital, or it must be recycled or donated. And take a look at that exclusion at the bottom. This is absolutely vital. If a company takes a product back, realizes they actually can't do anything with it, and just chucks it in the trash, it is completely excluded from the metric. You only get credit for true, verifiable diversion from the landfill. And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, Devices versus Simple Supplies, Categorizing the Waste. Think about it. A hospital uses wildly different things on a daily basis. An MRI machine is obviously very different from a standard surgical glove. So how on earth do we make sense of all these metric tons? Well, the SASB standard requires companies to break down the recovered waste into 2 very distinct buckets. On one side, we have devices and equipment. These are your high-value, advanced machines, the massive, complex tech that likely contains heavy metals, electronics, and intricate components. Then, on the other side, we have supplies. These are your simple, low-cost items like scalpels, gloves, and thermometers. By forcing companies to report these 2 categories separately, investors can instantly see if a company is just managing to recycle a bunch of simple plastics or if they're actually doing the really difficult, high-value work of refurbishing complex medical machinery. So we've looked at the design side, where companies report the revenue percentage of their sustainable products. And we've looked at the end-of-life side, where they have to report the total metric tons of diverted waste. So the big question you should be asking yourself when you read through these sustainability reports is this: does a high percentage of sustainable product revenue actually result in a massive amount of metric tons being diverted from the landfill? Because if a company is out there boasting about great design metrics, but they have 0 metric tons of product takebacks, well, you really have to wonder how sustainable that life cycle truly is. Keep that question in mind as you continue to explore this fascinating industry. Thank you so much for hanging out and learning with me today in this explainer.